Imagine being trapped in a room with your best friends, but something's terribly wrong. Something that wasn't there before. What happens when death isn't the end? When the darkness starts to pull you in, and you realize you might never escape? Stay with us to uncover the terrifying truth in this true crime documentary, where the line between life and death becomes blurred in the most horrifying way. You won't believe the chilling twist at the end. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. The night felt colder than usual. The moon barely peered through the heavy clouds. A small, isolated house stood in the distance. It was old, its wooden frame warped from years of neglect. The lights inside flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move. Inside, the scent of mildew and something sharper lingered in the air. It was the kind of smell that made you want to hold your breath. But it was the sound, or rather, the lack of it, that gripped the two friends. Anna and Beth had been close since childhood. They had shared secrets, dreams, and fears. They decided to explore the abandoned house on a dare. It seemed harmless enough. But something felt off as soon as they stepped inside. The floor creaked under their weight. A chill ran down their spines. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with something unspoken. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, as if they were being watched. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside, felt like an echo of something darker. They moved deeper into the house. The dim light of their flashlights danced across the walls. The once vibrant wallpaper was now peeling and faded. Each room they entered grew darker. The air thickened, making it hard to breathe. They found themselves standing before a closed door at the end of a narrow hall. A door that hadn't been touched in years. Anna reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. Beth stopped her. "Something's wrong," she whispered. But Anna, ever the brave one, ignored her. With a sharp twist, the door creaked open. The room beyond was a forgotten relic. Old furniture covered in dust, broken glass scattered on the floor. But there was something more. Something disturbing. At the far end of the room, two bodies lay on the ground, lifeless. The friends froze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The stench hit them next, foul, rancid. The bodies were unmistakable. It was them. It was their own faces staring back. Their best friends, lying dead. The scene was too much to process. But the worst part? Their eyes were wide open, staring straight at them. No sign of struggle. Just a cold, unnatural stillness. The air turned colder. Anna's heart raced in her chest. Beth's breath came out in shallow gasps. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The reality was suffocating. The flashlight in Anna's hand slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor with a sharp thud. And that's when they heard it. A soft creak. Behind them, a figure stepped out from the shadows. The figure moved slowly, deliberately. It was tall, unnaturally tall. The shape was cloaked in darkness, blending with the shadows. Anna's blood turned to ice. Beth's face went pale, her eyes wide with terror. Neither of them could move. The figure took another step forward. A soft whisper followed. "Why are you here?" The voice was low, almost a growl. It sent chills racing down their spines. Their hearts pounded in their chests, deafening in the silence. Beth opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Anna grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the door. But the figure wasn't done. It moved faster now, closing the distance in an instant. A hand reached out, impossibly long fingers brushing against Anna's cheek. Cold. So cold it felt like ice had seeped into her very bones. The figure's breath was ragged, shallow, like it hadn't breathed in years. Anna's skin prickled as a deep sense of dread overtook her. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know," Anna stammered. But the figure just stared, its eyes hollow, empty. There was no answer. Only an unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker. The air felt thicker, suffocating. The smell of decay grew stronger. Anna's pulse raced as she tried to pull Beth towards the door, but her legs felt like lead.
The door. It was so far away now.
Beth's voice cracked, barely a whisper. "We have to leave, now." But something stopped them. The door was gone. The hallway had vanished. They were trapped in that room, with no way out. The figure loomed over them, unblinking, unmoving. It seemed to grow taller, its form stretching unnaturally. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was a smile. A wide, cruel smile. That smile was the last thing she saw. Then there was nothing but darkness. When Anna's eyes finally opened again, the world was different. The room was eerily still. The oppressive darkness had lifted, but the air still felt thick with unease. Her head pounded. She blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Beth was gone. She could feel the weight of that absence like a heavy stone in her chest. The room was empty, save for the two lifeless bodies of the friends they had seen earlier. But now something was wrong. The bodies weren't still anymore. They moved. Tiny twitches at first, then bigger jerks. Anna's heart skipped a beat. She stumbled back, her legs weak, her breath shallow. Was this a dream? Was she still in the same nightmare? Her eyes darted to the door. It was back. It was open. She didn't think, she just ran. Her feet hit the floor in a frantic rush. Her body felt like it was moving on its own, desperate to escape. But as she reached the door, something cold grasped her wrist. A voice, soft but chilling, whispered in her ear. "You can't leave." Anna turned, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was there again. It was standing behind her, its hollow eyes fixed on her, unblinking. Its long fingers wrapped around her wrist, cold and unyielding. "Why are you here?" the voice repeated, this time louder. Anna's chest tightened, her pulse hammering in her throat. I was just... But the figure cut her off. "You shouldn't have come. Now you'll stay?" Before Anna could react, the world around her shifted again. The room seemed to distort, twisting as if reality itself was bending. The walls stretched, the shadows deepened. The figure grew larger. Looming, the bodies of the two friends on the floor began to rise. Not by their own will, but by something else. Something worse. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. The eyes that had once been lifeless were now wide open again. And they were staring at Anna. Staring with empty eyes. Anna gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She tried to pull away, but the figure held her tighter. Her heart raced. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. Her mind screamed for her to escape. But there was no escape. There was only the figure, the bodies, and the suffocating darkness closing in. Then, from somewhere far off, she heard a whisper. It wasn't the figure's voice this time. It was Beth's. A soft, desperate cry. "Anna?" The voice echoed in her mind. But it wasn't comforting. It was pleading. "Anna, help me." The whisper echoed in Anna's mind, sharp and frantic. "Anna, help me." It felt like a command. A plea. But Anna couldn't move. She was frozen. The grip on her wrist tightened, its coldness seeping deeper into her skin. The figure's breath was hot against her neck, making her skin crawl. The bodies on the floor were standing now, moving slowly, stiffly, as though they were puppets on invisible strings. Their eyes, empty and hollow, followed Anna's every move. The one closest to her was Beth, her best friend. But she wasn't Beth anymore. Not really. There was no recognition in her eyes. Only an emptiness. A void. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull away, but the figure held her in place. Its grip was like iron. "Please," Anna gasped, her voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, towering over her, its eyes never leaving hers. And then, As if it were all some twisted performance, the bodies of the two friends began to move toward her. Slow steps. Uneven. They were reaching for her. But they weren't alive. They couldn't be. Not anymore. Their fingers twitched. Their mouths opened, but no sound came. Their faces were pale, their skin blotchy and decayed. Anna's heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Her pulse was deafening in her ears. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She needed to escape. She needed to run. But every movement was slow, as if time itself had turned against her. Anna, Beth's voice whispered again, but it was not the voice she remembered. It was ragged, guttural. It sounded wrong. Anna's eyes darted from one body to the other. Beth, or what was left of her, was close now. Too close. Her hand reached for Anna's face, but the touch was cold. Dead cold. "Help me," it rasped. Anna recoiled, her body trembling. The figure behind her moved closer.
"Stay."
The voice was barely audible, but it was a command, cold and final. Anna couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. The room closed in tighter. The walls pressed against her. The floor beneath her feet felt like it was sinking. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, the whisper came again. But this time it wasn't from the bodies. It was from the figure. "You're one of us now." And Anna understood. It wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence. A sentence she couldn't escape. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Her body went numb. And then the room went black. In the darkness, Anna couldn't feel her body anymore. There was no light, no sound, just the weight of the silence pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, but it was slow, sluggish, like wading through thick mud. Then suddenly, a flicker of light. A weak pulse, like a heartbeat, illuminated the room. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But as the light grew brighter, so did the chilling presence around her. The shadows stretched and twisted, bending in unnatural ways. She could feel the weight of eyes on her. But there was nothing visible. The figure was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind. And then, just as quickly, the light faded. The suffocating blackness returned, thick and suffused with a quiet dread. Her heart raced, and she gasped, but there was no air. She couldn't breathe. "Anna," the voice. That voice again. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Beth's voice, but twisted, raspy,
"Weak."
"Anna." A soft whimper followed, almost too faint to hear. Anna tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her lips numb. "Beth," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. Nothing answered. The emptiness stretched, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Her hands shook, but she couldn't feel them. The cold air bit at her skin, deeper and deeper. Then, with a sudden jolt, a light flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was harsh, blinding. The room exploded with brightness. Anna squinted, her eyes unable to adjust to the intensity. And then, before her, she saw them. Beth and the others. The bodies. But they weren't standing anymore. They were lying in front of her, on the cold, hard floor. And they weren't dead anymore. They were alive. Their eyes were wide open, fixed on her. But there was something wrong. Something sick. Beth's eyes twitched. Her mouth stretched into a smile. A smile that was wrong. Too wide. The others did the same. Anna recoiled, her body trembling. Their eyes were hollow, empty of life. But the smile was worse. It stretched too far, unnaturally wide. And then, with a horrible snap, they all moved in unison. Toward her. Closer. Closer. Anna backed away, but the room had changed again. The walls seemed to press in, narrowing. She couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The figures moved faster now. Their mouths gaped open, too wide, as they reached for her. She tried to scream, but no sound came. And as they closed in around her, Anna realized something that made her blood run cold. They weren't just reaching for her.
They were pulling her in.
The darkness swallowed her whole. Anna's world spun violently, disorienting her senses. The figures, Beth and the others, closed in, their hands grasping at her, cold and clammy. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her legs wouldn't move. The room was no longer a room. It was a suffocating void, the walls no longer solid but shifting, breathing. With every breath, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the darkness. Their hands were everywhere. They scraped against her skin, pulling, dragging. Anna's eyes were wide with panic, searching for an escape that didn't exist. She wanted to scream.
She wanted to fight.
But her body was paralyzed. She was being consumed. Their hollow eyes stared into hers. Beth's face was so close, her smile wide, lips curling in a twisted expression of something that was once affection. But it was a mockery now. "Help me," Beth's voice croaked, distorted, as if it wasn't coming from her mouth at all. Anna's breath caught in her throat, the air thick and foul. "Help me." It was no longer a whisper. It was a demand, a command. But it wasn't Beth asking. It was something else, something far darker. The hands gripped tighter, their fingers digging into her flesh. And then, just as Anna thought she would suffocate, the world around her shifted again. The darkness split, revealing something far worse. A cavernous space.
Cold.
Empty. The figures surrounding her were no longer just shadows. They were real. The dead bodies of her friends stood before her, twisted in grotesque forms. Their faces were wrong, their bodies warped. But they were staring at her, hungry. Beth's eyes flickered, still empty, but somehow full of something more now. A malice that went beyond death. Anna could feel it, crawling up her spine. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. A low, eerie groan filled the air. The shadows stretched toward her like tendrils, reaching out with a slow, deliberate hunger. The figure behind her shifted, taking another step forward. Closer, closer, until its face was mere inches from hers. A face Anna knew so well, but it wasn't Beth anymore. It was something monstrous, twisted beyond recognition. "Why did you come?" the figure hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Anna's eyes filled with terror, and her body trembled uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the figure didn't care. The others closed in around her, their eyes still locked onto hers, full of hunger. The floor beneath her feet began to crack, fissures opening up, swallowing the light. The air was suffocating, pulling her deeper into the abyss. And just when she thought she would be lost forever, a voice cut through the void. A voice from the darkness. "Leave her." It wasn't the figure's voice. It wasn't Beth. It was something else. Something more powerful. The figures paused. The room fell silent. Anna's body went rigid, every muscle straining against the pull. The voice came again. "Leave her." The figures faltered, their movements stilled. Anna's breath was shallow, ragged. She couldn't understand what was happening. But as the shadows began to recede, the figures stepped back, retreating into the corners of the room. And Anna felt the pressure on her chest loosen. But she didn't dare move. The darkness didn't let her. It was watching, waiting. The air was still, but it felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. The figures, Beth, the others, had backed away, but they didn't disappear. No, they lingered, watching her with eyes that saw right through her, as if she were already a part of their world. The darkness seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat that made Anna's heart race in response. She could feel it. Something was changing. The voice that had spoken before was still echoing in the vast, empty space. It wasn't gone. It was waiting, waiting for something. Anna swallowed hard, trying to summon the strength to move, to break free from the weight of the moment. But her legs were still unresponsive, as if the terror had paralyzed them. The figures remained silent, their hollow eyes locked on her, never blinking, never shifting. And then, slowly, one of them took a step forward. Beth's face, still twisted into that wide, grotesque smile, hovered just in front of Anna. The air around her seemed to freeze. She could almost feel the coldness radiating from Beth's body, though it was nothing like what she remembered. It was wrong.
So wrong.
Anna, Beth rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. Help me. But it wasn't Beth's voice.
Anna knew that now.
It was the voice of something ancient, something beyond death. And it was mocking her. A laugh echoed through the void, hollow and broken, like the cracking of glass. Beth's lips stretched farther into that horrible smile. Anna's stomach churned. It was as if the world itself had twisted and folded in on her. The darkness closed in again, suffocating, crawling toward her like tendrils, pulling her back into its grip. Her breath was ragged, her skin clammy with sweat, but she couldn't look away. The figures were no longer just standing. They were moving closer. But this time, they didn't reach for her. They were circling like predators. And they were getting closer. Closer. Anna's mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She could feel them now, their presence growing heavier. They weren't just shadows. They were memories. The faces of her friends, now twisted, distorted by something evil, surrounded her. And the darkness, it was alive. It was suffocating her. Please don't, Anna whispered, her voice trembling. But it was too late. The floor beneath her feet cracked open once again. A black void yawned wide beneath her, its depths endless and cold. The figures watched, their eyes now gleaming with a hungry anticipation. Anna's legs buckled as the ground gave way beneath her. And as she fell into the darkness, she finally understood. There was no escape. She was trapped. Forever. The void swallowed her whole. The darkness consumed her, dragging her down into the endless blackness. Her body fell through the void, weightless and disoriented. The air was thick, suffocating, and the cold seeped into her bones. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed before it could escape. The emptiness seemed to stretch on forever. It was like falling into nothingness, a place where time didn't exist, where nothing made sense. Her mind raced, her pulse hammering in her ears, but everything was a blur. And then, without warning, the fall stopped. The floor beneath her was solid again, cold and smooth. She didn't move at first. She couldn't. The silence was deafening. Her breaths were shallow, her body trembling. When she finally opened her eyes, she was in a place that wasn't quite real. The room was familiar but wrong. It was the same as the room with the bodies, with the figure, with Beth's twisted smile. But now there were no bodies, no figures, no shadows. Everything was still, too still. The walls were smooth, clean, almost sterile. But the air, it felt wrong. It was thick, like it was charged with something, a heavy presence that weighed down on her chest. Anna stood up slowly, her legs weak, her body unsteady. She looked around, trying to make sense of it. The walls were blank. There was no door, no window, just the same oppressive silence. She took a cautious step forward. Her footsteps echoed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Something shifted in the corner of her eye. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the far corner, was a figure. Not one of the twisted bodies, not Beth or the others. This figure was different. It stood motionless, its back to her, cloaked in shadow. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its presence. It was more than just a figure. It was something waiting. Her heart skipped a beat as she took another step forward, the air growing colder with each movement. And then the figure turned, slowly, deliberately. Its face was hidden in the shadow of its hood, but Anna could feel its gaze. It was watching her. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask who it was, what it wanted. But the words never came. The figure took a step toward her. The space between them seemed to stretch and contract in strange, unnatural ways. And as it drew closer, a voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't the figure's voice, but something deeper, older, pulling her into the abyss once more. "You're still here, Anna." The words reverberated, wrapping around her like a cold, invisible chain. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden, but now the shadows seemed to pulse with its movements. And again that voice. "You belong to us now." The words slithered through her thoughts, like venom seeping into her mind. And Anna understood. She had never truly left. She had never escaped the darkness. And now there was no way out. The figure reached out, its hand cold and pale. Anna's heart stopped, her breath caught in her throat as it touched her shoulder. And with that touch, the shadows closed in. The walls warped, the space around her flickered like a dying flame. She was falling again, deeper this time, into an abyss that had no end. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, Anna's last thought was clear. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone.
She was a part of this now.
Forever. The darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her deeper than ever before. But this time, something was different. The cold didn't feel like it was consuming her. It felt distant. Fading. Anna's heart was still racing, but it wasn't fear that gripped her anymore. It was confusion. She opened her eyes, unsure of what she would see. The void or something else. But when she looked around, the darkness had faded. Instead, she was standing in a new place, somewhere familiar, yet foreign. It was a room, but not like the one before. The walls were pristine, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. It felt peaceful here, almost serene. But something told her it wasn't real. This wasn't the end. Her surroundings shifted, flickering between the soft glow of the room and the oppressive blackness she'd just left. Anna's breath caught in her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't like the others. This figure had no face, only a shadowy blur where its features should have been. And yet, Anna knew it was watching her, waiting. The presence was familiar. It was the same one that had followed her in the dark, pulling her deeper. It was the one that had whispered, "You belong to us now." She opened her mouth to speak, but the figure raised a hand. The voice echoed in her mind again, deeper, clearer this time. "You think you're free. You think you've escaped." The words twisted like knives, but Anna didn't flinch. "You've been here longer than you realize." She felt the weight of those words, as if they were sinking into her very soul. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "No, I didn't." But the figure's voice only grew louder, more powerful. "Your soul is ours, Anna. You are one of us." The light flickered again. The walls began to close in on her. But this time, Anna didn't feel the same terror. This time, there was no scream. There was only a quiet acceptance. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fighting. The truth had settled into her bones. And as the figure stepped forward, Anna stood still, waiting, her heart no longer afraid.
She was home now.
In the place where the darkness ruled, where she belonged. And when the figure finally reached out, her body was ready. The shadows embraced her once more. And Anna, finally at peace, vanished into the dark. Forever. The darkness enveloped Anna completely, but this time, there was no fear. No panic. Only an overwhelming sense of stillness. The cold, once suffocating, now felt like an old friend, familiar, comforting, even. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat steady. It was as if she had become part of the void itself. The figure, no longer just a shadow, stepped into view again. This time, it was clearer, more defined. It wasn't the twisted, threatening presence that had followed her before. It had changed. Its features were still hidden in shadow, but Anna could feel its gaze, the weight of its presence. "You are at peace now," it whispered, the voice calm, almost gentle. Anna's eyes, once wide with terror, slowly closed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt no fear, no uncertainty. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't lost. This place, this darkness, was home now. Her mind drifted, thoughts fading into a tranquil emptiness. The walls that once closed in on her, suffocating, now felt distant. The weight of everything she had felt before was gone, replaced by something serene. A quiet acceptance. And for the first time she understood. This was her place now, her existence woven into the fabric of the dark, infinite space that surrounded her. She had been searching for an escape, trying to run from the truth. But now, she realized, there was no escaping what she had already become. And that realization no longer filled her with dread. It filled her with peace. The figure stepped closer, its presence now less imposing, more understanding. "Welcome home," it said, its voice like a soft echo. And as Anna exhaled her final breath, her spirit fully embraced the dark. She knew there was no more fear. There was only calm, only peace. And the darkness swallowed her completely. A final, silent embrace. And Anna was no more. Not in the way she had been, but something different now. Part of the dark, part of the void. The story ended, not with a scream, but with the quiet settling of the eternal night.